So we made it. It looks like we might finish this book of Ruth today. I was tempted to come back and put a sign out there, Wrapping Up Ruth Part 1. Because you could do that, you know. Wrapping Up Ruth Part 2. But we're wrapping up Ruth right now. And just to kind of recap, because it's been 4 weeks since we were here, you know, looking at Ruth. Ruth is a story written at a time of David, but the story takes place during the period of the Judges. And I had to just figure out a way, you know, how do you fit the eclipse into wrapping up Ruth, you know, because that's the big thing this week is this lunar eclipse, solar eclipse that's taking place. The time of the Judges was a spiritual eclipse in the history of Israel. The time of Judges was a time when the darkness overshadowed much of the light. But what we find in this book of Ruth, what we find here is this, if you really look at it, this light that can just burn your retinas off. This light in this book of Ruth is this place in the midst of a dark era that shows the gospel, that shows God's plan, that shows God's sovereignty, that shows how God does not marginalize women or widows or the disenfranchised, a blazing light that if we look at it, it'll change us. Ruth is a subplot in God's greatest story of redemption. Our lives are subplots in God's story of redemption, you know, and what we've been trying to do, and what we said when we began this whole thing, is I talked about Michelangelo and how Michelangelo, when he was beginning to work on a piece that he was going to put on a wall, he would draw it out on paper first, sketch it out on paper, and then he'd put pinholes all around in the drawing, and then he'd put the drawing up on the wall, and then he'd take a bag full of charcoal dust and he would smack it all around the paper, and then he'd take the paper down and there'd be these dots all around on the wall. And that's what he used to be able to draw his masterpiece, create his masterpiece on the wall. And so what we've been saying throughout this series, and what I've been hoping that everyone, including myself, that we're thinking of doing, is that we're kind of reading this story of Ruth and putting pinholes in it where it lines up with our lives and where our lives should be lined up, and so that we can put it up against the wall of time, and we can smack it with some kind of dust and take it down and see where we're off track and see where we need to align ourselves to be better in line with the story of Ruth that we find here in this book. And so that's what we've been doing, and we've been also looking at doing timelines of the storyline in Ruth, but also in our own lives, the upturns, the downturns. And so we see that in the book of Ruth that there was a famine, and that's how things began. A famine in the land. In Bethlehem, there was no bread, and that the author makes a point to say that there was no bread in Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. And Jesus is the bread that comes from Bethlehem, and there's all kinds of connecting points. But there's a famine in the land, and that drives this family into Moab. And then Elimelech, the father, dies, the husband dies. But then the upturn is the sons get married, and then the downturn is that the sons die, and 3 women are left, 3 widows. And we talked about in this we talked about the plight of the widow, and we watched a video that Oprah did about how widows are treated in India, and how it was similar how widows were treated in India to how widows were treated in Israel. How widows were treated culturally, how they were marginalized. They had no inheritance. They had no way of protection. They had no way of sustaining an income. And so the older ones just begged for food, and many of the younger ones were forced into prostitution or other types of things. And so the widows were treated terribly across the board culturally. And so this book of Ruth changes all of that. This book of Ruth says the God of Israel is not someone who marginalizes widows. The God of Israel is not someone who allows those things to happen. He changes the whole scope of the culture just in the writing of this book. We also talked about how Job and Naomi were very similar, that Naomi was a female kind of counterpart to Job, and that we understood that in both accounts that suffering and loss is not explained. We don't get great answers for suffering and loss in the book of Ruth. We don't get great answers for suffering, loss, and loss in the book of Job. And we don't get great answers in the suffering and loss in our own lives today. We hold on to a faith, but we don't always get great answers. Both stories, Job and Naomi, we said, invite us to wrestle with God and His goodness in the midst of our trials, in the midst of our sufferings. Both lost their children and their future existence. We spent a lot of time talking about how in the days of Ruth, the most important thing was to have a family line that extended past your existence, that continued on. To know that your family line would be cut off was the worst thing. And so they both lost their children and their future existence. Naomi, however, is in a foreign land. She's lost her spouse and her sons, and she becomes a widow. Naomi has no hope. She comes back to Bethlehem and says, don't call me Naomi, but call me bitter, because I left empty. I left full, and I came back empty. So Job and Naomi, we saw that they were kind of counterparts. And I realized I'm going to have to do Ruth part 1, closing wrap-up part 1 next week, because it's going to take us all this sermon time just to say this is where we've been. We talked about a childbearing culture and how important a child was in that culture, but not just any child. It needed to be a son. It was a patriarchal system, and sons were how land was inherited and perpetuated and all of that. And so other religions were caught up in fertility of the land and about bearing children, livestock worship, temple practice. There was immense pressure for a son to perpetuate the family name and financial stability for the next generation. It was a huge thing. Blame for not producing a son was squarely placed on the woman, and failure to produce a son was likely to result in a divorce, or, as we see in Scripture, Abraham, was waiting for his son, didn't get a son, and so they picked up someone else and so Hagar became his surrogate kind of thing, so that he could have a son. It was all about having a son. So we talked about childbearing and how difficult that must have been. We talked about how difficult it must have been for the person who was barren, for the woman who couldn't conceive, how every month when a period would come, every month during that flow, the hurt, the depression, the sadness, the anxiety of whether or not this month I will be cast out because I haven't had children, and how difficult it was. And that for 10 years, Ruth went through, or however long it was before her husband passed away, but for as much as 10 years, she never had a child. Every month, there was that sadness coming back. But then we find this happening. Ruth and Naomi come back, and Ruth takes initiative and says, let me go out to the field and glean in the field. And so she says this in Ruth 2, she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. And what we said was this was unheard of. We said that this is the order of how things worked in the field. The hired hands did the harvesting. They would grasp the handles of the barley and with a sickle, and they would cut them down, and then after that, female workers would walk behind them and gather up large bundles and tie those bundles up. And then the gleaners could come in after the bundles that were tied up were brought out of the field. The gleaners could come in, and this was a part of a system that God had set up for people who were poor to be able to come in and scavenge the fields for grain that was left over. But Ruth comes in and says, can I gather with the female workers? It was unheard of. It was unheard of. And so when Boaz is confronted with this request, he responds with grace. And when Naomi understands that Boaz is responding to grace, she wakes up out of a spiritual flatline. Somehow she is, by God's Spirit, and when she sees this, she's kind of, clear, and the shock happens, and she's resuscitated to have a spiritual heartbeat again, and she starts to see that God's Hesed grace is there. And we talked a lot about this idea of Hesed. Hesed is a word that we can't translate into English with just a single word, so it gets translated loving kindness. It gets translated everlasting love. It gets translated as different words or compound words to say this level of love beyond. And what we talked about was we said that Hesed involved a kind of a legal responsibility with the ability to say no. This legal responsibility to act, but with the ability to say no. And it was to help someone who was less fortunate. And so we see this being played out, going on and on, that this Hesed, this extending more grace than what anyone would do, plays out. We did some other neat things too. We looked in chapter 2 and we said that there was these chiasms that took place. A chiasm is when you indent into a center thing. And so in chapter 2 we said that we saw these layers, bookends, if you will. A bookend is a great way to talk about a chiasm. There was these bookends where the prologue and the epilogue both talked about the same thing. And then Naomi working and is there in the purple, and then Ruth is there. And then in the center we said that's the main thing. That's when there's a chiasm, it's a form of poetry, and that was the main thing. And the main thing was that God's loving kindness, that God's Hesed grace was active and moving, and that God had not forgotten them. This was the main point that we saw in chapter 2. You're going to see something else similar to this in a minute. That's why I show this. So then we talked about how Naomi and Ruth, they come up with this plan, and Ruth actually proposes, asks Boaz to marry her. Unheard of. We look at this picture and we go, wait a minute. That's not the way it happens. There's nothing like wrong if it happens that way, right? I mean, there's no law that tells us that it has to happen where the guy proposes to the girl, but it could happen this way, but it's culturally awkward somewhat today. It doesn't happen. And yet 2,000, 3,000 years ago, this happened. If you think it was awkward, it might be awkward today. Think back then in the society that existed for a woman to actually propose to a man. But that's what Ruth does. Ruth is not willing to be sidelined. Ruth isn't just taking the culture as it is. Ruth is a change agent in the culture. And we see from that God calls us, that God calls women to be included into his plan where they're not marginalized. We saw that everyone was willing to sacrifice. We saw that Naomi's plan was for Ruth to go to Boaz and just ask for marriage, not for the redeeming and the redemption of the property and the land. Ruth was just told, just go and just go for the marriage, not the property. The property would have benefited Naomi. Naomi is willing to sacrifice her property so that Ruth has someone to protect her as she moves on. And Ruth says that she'll follow that plan. So Ruth dresses up with perfume, uncovers his feet. We talked about that not being something that happened that shouldn't have happened. It was very dignified what happened. Ruth follows the plan right up to the point where she asks him to marry, and she includes the redemption of the land. So Ruth is willing to sacrifice everything for Naomi. So Ruth's plan is a great sacrifice. And then Boaz has no gain to pull in and to expend money to purchase property for Naomi, but Boaz sees this as Hesed grace, and Boaz is willing to sacrifice everything, his reputation, his finances, his son's future, because we probably can see that Boaz had already been married. Boaz isn't puzzled by Ruth's actions at all, and he calls Ruth's action hesed. It's just this whole book is full of hesed. Everyone is willing to sacrifice. Boaz's plan is one of great sacrifice, as we're going to find out today. And then we talked about this. This was the last thing that we said in Ruth chapter 3. Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens." And that's where you've been. Whew. We've just gone through this kind of the catch-up of Ruth from 1 to 3 in many parts, more than 3 parts. And this is where we left off the last time. You're just going to have to wait and see what happens. And so you've been waiting for 4 weeks to see what happened. And we're going to get there. You know, I think, look at it. We'll do it. So, we're at chapter 4. Let's take a look and kind of walk our way through chapter 4. So here we find, meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. So what has happened is Ruth has asked Boaz to marry her for marriage and for redemption of the land. Boaz knows that the person who has the right to redeem the land is not him. Boaz could have married Ruth without a kinsman redeemer. These are terms that we talked about. Boaz could have married Ruth without that. No one would have minded. That's what Naomi had sent Ruth to do. But Ruth ups the ante, and Ruth says, "Marry me, but redeem all of the property and the family name as well." And Boaz sees it as hesed, as grace, and he says, "I'm not the guy in line, but I'm going to go to him. And if he chooses to redeem the land and to redeem you, so be it. But if he doesn't, I promise you, I will." So Ruth goes back to Naomi, and Boaz goes to the city gate. Now, the city gate in Israel, the city gate in culture at that time, was more like a combination of the courthouse and the town hall. When you entered into the city gate, there was a side area where you could sit, and it's a place where the dignitaries met. It's the place where politics happened. It's the place where judgments were made. It's the place where transactions, legal transactions, sale of land and things like that, it's a place where all of those things were made. And so Boaz goes in to the city gate. Now, let me go back a second and talk about this because we're at the city gate. When I got married, I had this section of this chapter read before everybody because it was just so important to me. And this is Proverbs chapter 31. And it talks about, the very last chapter of Proverbs talks about a wife of noble character. And so listen to how Proverbs ends real quickly. "A wife of noble character, who can find? She's worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She's like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it's still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about to work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable and her lamp does not go out all night. In her hand she holds the distaff of grapes and the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she's no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for her bed. She's clothed with fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes a seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies the merchants with sashes. She's clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom. Faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the reward that she has earned, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. Now, what's interesting is that when Christians canonized the Christian scriptures in the Old Testament, they put Ruth chronological, right where it belongs, right after the book of Judges. Because Ruth took place, as we already said, during the time of Judges. But in the Hebrew canon, do you know where Ruth was? Right after Proverbs. Before chapters meant like what roadblocks like we think of today. I think that the Hebrew canon accurately says, this is Ruth. It's a lead-in to telling you. I got chills right now. This is a lead-in to telling you about Ruth. And then when you look at the book of Proverbs and how it just lifts up virtue and lifts up the character and the nobility of Boaz, that you can see that Proverbs is the perfect book to usher in and introduce in action everything that's being called out for wisdom in the other. So meanwhile, Boaz went to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. The NIV translation does a little injustice here, because it's much more emphatic of that it happened, like immediately it happened. This idea of meanwhile, it's all this happened. He walked into the gate and there he was. In the same way that when the servant was sent to find a wife and Rebekah came out immediately after praying, it's the same kind of thing that this just happened. And what it should be doing to us is telling us that God is active in their lives, setting up the plan, making things happen, the clockwork, the tick, the tock of the clock, all of that is happening. And you know what? It's happening in our lives too. The tick, the tock, the clock, it's all happening in our lives. We can read this, and as we hit the bag of chalk dust against the wall, we can say, if God was working in their lives to orchestrate the events and the timing of everything, then he's doing that now in our lives too. So Boaz finds him immediately. God kind of puts him in his path, and then Boaz takes action and goes and finds 10 elders. So Boaz took 10 of the elders to the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who's come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech." Selling is probably not the right word either. It's more like what we would understand, but it's kind of more like a lease. Probably what happened is that when Elimelech had to move to Moab during the famine, that he sold the rights to the land to produce from the land, that he sold that to somebody, and that is what they're looking to purchase back. So it's more of a purchasing back that's going on. Another interesting thing. Who is this kinsman redeemer that they're talking about? Who is this guy? We don't know. He's like no name. Who is he? Everybody else has a name in the story. This guy doesn't get a name. And as we'll see, the guy who tries to preserve his name doesn't get a mention. Who knows who he is? Boaz then just says this, "I thought I should bring the matter to your attention." Now, Boaz knew who the first kinsman redeemer was. I'm banking that the kinsman redeemer knew who he was. And what's going on here is the kinsman redeemer, who has kind of an obligation to purchase the land, but he really doesn't. The legal law says that if there are sons, then the sons own the land. If there are daughters, then the daughter owns the land, but it can be repurchased by a family member. But if there's no daughters, the widow is left out of the picture. So there's a legal loophole here that says that neither of them really have to purchase that land back. But the other legal matter is the first kinsman, this no-name guy, he inherits the land when Naomi dies. If Naomi doesn't get remarried and somehow have a son, the land goes to him anyway. So he knows it. He's just keeping quiet. He's letting time go by, and he'll double his property. That's what he's waiting for. So I love how Boaz says, I thought I should just bring it to your attention and suggest that you buy in the presence of those seated here, the elders of my people. So he's saying the right thing to do, not necessarily the legal thing, the right thing to do. Boaz is saying the right thing to do, the hesed thing to do, this kind of legal obligation where you can say no, but out of love you say yes. That's what hesed is. So Boaz is saying, just making you aware, the right thing to do would be for you to buy this land. He doesn't mention anything about Ruth or Naomi. So what happens? He says, I'll redeem it, he said. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabite, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Now again, there's no real legal reason that the kinsman has to do this. It's extended to the brother, and that's really as far as it goes. There's a loophole, but what Boaz is doing is he's saying, here's the right thing to do. And Boaz has this reputation, we've seen it already, he has this reputation where he's a good guy, and he's pretty popular. If you look at Boaz's genealogy, he goes back with famous names like Nahshon, who led the charge out of the assembly during Moses' time. He was the first person to offer a sacrifice. Nahshon was this big guy in the history of Israel and other people. Boaz is kind of like a Kennedy. Like a Clinton, like a Bush. He's got this genealogy that has incredible amounts of clout to it. And so Boaz is saying, here's the right thing to do. And he's basically forcing the man into doing something. He doesn't mind expending money that he's going to get back, though. He doesn't really want to, but he can expend money and get it back. But when Boaz says, Ruth and Naomi are part of the package, at this, the kinsman redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. So a number of years ago, I'm thinking probably 25 years ago, we tried to move. We put our house up for sale. He's already back there. He knows where I'm going. So Mark and I, we were friends. We were in a Bible study was going on at my house at the time. A lot of people, even from here, were coming to this Bible study. And we were going to buy a bigger house. And it was actually close to my friend Glenn's house. And so Mark says to Glenn, God loves me more. And I'll prove it to you because he's not going to let Joe move away from me to live close to you. So we tried selling our house, and it didn't work. We couldn't get a buyer for our house. And it came down to this. The realtor came and said, we have another offer on the house that you're trying to buy. But you have the right to go forward and just take out another mortgage and carry 2 mortgages until your house sells. I think I was in the same place as this kinsman redeemer. If he took Ruth and Naomi, and if somehow Ruth became pregnant with a son, he would lose all of this. And he would lose the investment of purchasing the land back for them. He would lose all of that. I think after the famine, not too many people had the wealth to really be able to purchase something like that, except for Boaz. Boaz could purchase it. But I think the kinsman redeemer is going, I can't, just like I did. I couldn't do 2 mortgages. I couldn't take the risk of losing them both. And that's what he's saying right here. Because I might endanger my own estate, I'm out. So, by the way, God loves Mark more than Glenn. We didn't sell the house. The day we took it off the market, he drove out to my house and ripped the sign out of the front lawn and threw it, shouting, tell Glenn Hillard that God loves me more. But interesting how in the book of Ruth and in our lives today, small things like that make a huge difference. Had I bought that house, I don't know that I would be here. I'd be at Glenn's church. I don't know. You know, these are the things that happen. So he's saying, I can't put my estate, even though the risks are not, that high. I mean, she's been barren for 10 years. All the blame was put on the woman. But God could do something, and God has been doing something, and God is obviously doing something because Boaz is involved in making a play here, and so here it happens. So now we get this little segue. This is interesting. Now, in earlier times in Israel, this was written at the time of David about something that happened during the time of Judges. Not a huge amount of time, but during that amount of time, this tradition was somehow lost because the writer had to explain it. So the writer explains, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. So if you went to a house closing back then, you wouldn't sign something, you would take off your shoes. I think when they came up with closed shoes and not sandals, and foot odor started to really come into existence, they probably changed that tradition and went to, why don't we just sign something? Okay, so I got my shoe back on. So he removed his sandal. What's that? Praise God. You're lucky it didn't say take off both. So then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife. So now we get to understand which of the 2 sons Ruth was married to. It's revealed here. But isn't it interesting that the writer includes everyone's name? Everyone's name is included here and brought back, saying they have all been redeemed. This idea of redemption is happening. They've all been redeemed. Everyone is named except Orpah, the other daughter-in-law who went back to Moab. She's not named. And the kinsman redeemer, mystery guy, never named. Then the elders and all those at the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your life like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So, some kind of prophetic prayer is happening at the city gates as well. That the name would become famous, that it would come from Bethlehem, that Rachel and Leah was the mother of Judah. So Leah, who was rejected in Scripture, is brought back in and not marginalized in the larger scheme of the story. Leah is brought back in and has the son Judah, and Judah is the line of Jesus as well. And so all of these different things are being brought together. All of the things and all of the people that you think are marginalized are not marginalized. Verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. 7 sons was basically an idiom of the perfect family. You know, you were blessed beyond blessed if you had 7 sons, the complete number of sons. And so here a blessing is given. Then Naomi took the child, laid him on her lap, and cared for him. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son. Who has a son? Ruth had the son. But Naomi has a son. Somehow this is being brought in to restore Naomi. Not that the tragedy ends, not that her sadness of losing her husband and 2 children end. That doesn't go away. That hurt, that hole doesn't get filled. But somehow God comes alongside and fills something else beside it. Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed, which means he will serve. And Ruth is serving, and Naomi is serving, and Boaz is serving, and it's just a fitting name that he would have. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Abinadab. Abinadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Solomon. Solomon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse. Jesse, the father of David. So in the midst of all of this, God is working in the heavenly realms. God is working in and around through the suffering and through the difficulties. And just to close a little bit more, just to tell you, Scripture, the content of Scripture is what's important. But God gives us, and the writers of Scripture give us even sometimes more beauty as well. This is a picture that displays some of the art of this book. There are a number of chiasms. We did one in chapter 2 that we reviewed today. But the entire book of Ruth is this stepping in, bookends thing that somehow the author was carefully doing. And so we see that at the beginning, we see Naomi was too old to conceive, and at the end, a son is born to Naomi. They're communicating, the writer is communicating grace of God through this whole idea that Naomi had the son and who couldn't have the son. Possible Redeemer is introduced in 2 verse 1. The Redeemer becomes the reality at chapter 4. So we're kind of working our way in. It's phenomenal. Ruth and Naomi start a plan. Ruth and Naomi's plan is fulfilled. Ruth is in Boaz's field, and there Ruth and the field are being discussed at the city gates. Boaz comes back from Bethlehem, and Boaz goes to Bethlehem. Boaz asks, whose woman is that? Naomi asks, who are you? One of the translations, if you look in the NIV at this verse, it doesn't say, who are you? But that's what happened. When Ruth came back with the grain from the threshing floor, the NIV says, what happened? But what's really it's saying is, who are you? Who's at the door? So this question is being asked. Ruth comes under Boaz's protection, and Boaz promises to marry Ruth for a protection that goes on at a deeper level than what it was before. Naomi blesses Boaz. Boaz blesses Ruth. Boaz, a potential redeemer. Ruth challenges Boaz to act as the redeemer. Ruth joins Boaz's workers, and Ruth identifies herself as Boaz's worker, handmaid. And at the middle of it all is this plan of Naomi and Ruth to bring about a marriage to Boaz, to bring about a child that would produce the Christ. Now, when they do chiasms like this, very often they put one more thing at the end just to bookend with the center point to say, this is it. This is the big deal. The epilogue is about a grandfather, a son that's a grandfather of King David. So you just have to wonder, did Naomi talk to Obed? She had to. She raised him. Did Naomi talk to Obed? Did Ruth talk to Obed about God's hesed grace, about God's provision through the greatest of sufferings, about how God is able to tackle anything that comes your way, about how God steps in for you, about you don't have to fear the enemy when God steps in? Do you think that happened? Do you think that they told Obed those things? Do you think Obed told that to Jesse? Do you think Jesse spent time telling his sons about the grace of God, the power of God against the enemy? And do you think that he had a son who listened? So much so that when a giant called Goliath challenges God's army, that a young boy picks up 5 stones from a brook and takes him on in the name of God. So how do you line up? When you put the painting of Ruth, when you put the drawing of Ruth up against the wall with the pinholes in it, and you smack it against the wall of your life, and it reveals things about where you should be, where the lines should be and where the lines are not, and where the lines are right and where the lines are not, are you more like Orpah, who makes logical decisions, reasonable decisions, but doesn't dip into this hesed grace, this kind of extension of trust in God, this kind of extension of loving in a responsibility with a free choice to say no? Do you line up more with Orpah, who's not willing to take a risk, who's not willing to be loyal, who's not willing to dedicate it all? Are you like the unknown guy who's financially looking for it, but when he finds out the risk financially, he walks away? I wonder if this guy's descendant was the rich young ruler who came to Jesus but walked away because he had so much. Wouldn't put his estate at risk. Or are you more like Ruth? Someone who initiates things, someone who doesn't take the cultural norm and allow it to happen, someone who challenges the status quo, someone who sees hesed as being what should be and not what is the law, but what should be. We find the Pharisees interpreting what should be to protect things like the Sabbath and moving into legalism, but we don't see them in the social justice stream saying what should be. Are you like Naomi? Empty, spiritually flatlined, and maybe you need some form of resuscitation. God's hesed is there for you too. It's in, it's around, it's all around you. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we need a community of people to help us see it. Are you like Boaz? Noble character. When challenged with what needs to be done, steps up to the plate and does what needs to be done and does more. The book of Ruth. Just 4 simple chapters. So much more than a love story. And yet, the greatest love story. God's redemption is real today as it was then. Let's pray. Father, we just thank you for your grace, for your hesed love, your loving kindness, your never-ending love, your attraction to us. Lord, may we be better at following you. May we be much more like Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, and may we step away from being so concerned about our own estate that we're like the unknown one. Or Lord, that even like Orpah who makes a reasonable decision. Lord, in the face of grace, may we step out in grace, knowing that your plan is real and your plan is there for your glory and for us to be adventurous. So, Lord, help us be adventurous today in Jesus' name. Amen. We take up this morning's offering.